Hello and welcome to our August event, Hallmarks of Mughal Art with Dr. Ursula Weekes. Ursula is an independent art historian who specialises in Mughal art. She got her undergraduate degree in history from St John's College at Cambridge and pursued an MA and PhD at the Courtauld Institute of Art on printmaking in 15th century Europe. She lived in India for 6 years where she fell in love with her new specialism, and she is currently writing a book on Mughal court painting. My name's Han, and I'm the social media and communications manager for Athena Art Foundation. We're a small organisation that is dedicated to promoting pre-modern art from across the world. So, first up, I just wanted to know straight away, what was the reason that drew you to this topic? Because I was looking at your background, and you did your PhD at the Courtauld on 15th century engraving in Europe. So it was a bit of a jump for you, right? Topics.
It was definitely. I just finished my PhD, published it as a book, which is called Early Engravers and Their Public. And then my husband got a job in Delhi. And I was like, well, I really want to develop further, my academic studies and career. And I got a postdoctoral fellowship. And the real sort of connection for me, having worked on prints in the 15th century, so many prints were brought to India in the 16th century by Jesuit missionaries, by merchants, by adventurers, by diplomats. And they had a very profound kind of resonance in India with artists borrowing from them, using them at the Mughal court. And so that was sort of my entree into Mughal painting. And I lived in Delhi for 7 years. That was an amazing experience, just to be so embedded in a different culture. And I pretty quickly decided this was going to be my new sort of like academic field that I would work in.
And do you ever miss your sort of old area, or do you still sort of find little? So I also have hopped, obviously in a much shorter time than you, from I was originally sort of very interested in sort of like Roman imperial art in sort of houses and villas, and then I completely switched to Syrian art. So, and I still get really excited when I go back and sort of have those snippets into my past. Do you still feel that excitement?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a year or two ago, I was in Dresden, and there's this wonderful artist called Master W with the Key who made these amazing engravings in the late 15th century of ships. And I just had to go into the print room there and order them up and have a good look. And it felt like I was really sort of, yeah, definitely. I still actually occasionally speak and write in that area as well. So I love it when the whole of your life all connects up. So yeah.
Fab. Well, if we can go to start the slides, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll move them forward. Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, so first up, if you guys have all seen the intros and the promotional, the picture on the right was used, and I would love if you could just tell me a little bit about that, because it's just, to me, it's just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, so Hannah asked me to do this session, and I sort of really left it up to her to choose whatever images would promote the event. And she chose so many fantastic images. I thought, well, I just take pretty much all the images she's chosen to promote the event to speak about. And this is a particularly interesting painting. And in a way, it gets to the heart of what Mughal painting was all about. So the Mughals were the rulers of India. Basically, they conquered India in 1526, and their empire really lasted until 1857. But the sort of major period of their artistic atelier is in the sort of later part of the 16th century and the 17th into the 18th century. So they were originally a Turco-Mongol dynasty that were also very heavily influenced and embedded within Persian culture. And the foundation of Mughal painting really began when the second Mughal emperor, Humayun, sort of lost his empire in India, and he had to go and take refuge at the court of the Safavid Shah Tahmasp. Now, Shah Tahmasp had this incredible personal sort of workshop of artists at his royal court. And this was kind of the inspiration primarily for Humayun then to develop his own atelier. And it was very much part of the Timurid tradition, which is how the Mughals traced their ancestry to have very refined book arts. And so when Humayun then finally regained India in 1555, he had been able to secure two artists from Shah Tahmasp's atelier. They were called Abdus Samad and Mir Said Ali, and they became the sort of like core beginning of the Mughal atelier. So the very beginnings of Mughal painting are really rooted in Safavid and late Timurid painting, in Persian painting, in other words. And it was only once they came to India and drew in other Indian artists that it developed its own kind of look about it. Now, this painting is really interesting because of that beginnings, as it were, the Mughal emperors always had a special reverence for Persian art. And Farrukh Beg, the artist of this particular work, was like one of those stellar kind of Michelangelo type artists who was working for a half brother of the Mughal Emperor Akbar in Kabul. But after Akbar's half brother died, Farrukh Beg was brought to the Mughal court. And when he came to the Mughal court, which at that time had the capital was at Lahore in modern day Pakistan, he brought with him a number of paintings. And this painting is one of the works which we are pretty sure that he would have brought with him when he came from Kabul to Lahore to then work for the Emperor Akbar. And so many elements in the painting are typical of Persian style, with this like gold background, the beautiful use of and profusion of different patterns. This lovely tree in the background is a plane tree, a chenar tree, which was the kind of quintessential royal tree of Persian art. Now, this painting shows Babur, the first Mughal emperor, receiving courtiers, but we're pretty sure that this painting originally was made at the court of Akbar's half-brother in Kabul, a guy called Mirza Muhammad Hakim, because this painting, which is in another Mughal album, shows Mirza Muhammad Hakim with Haji Yakut. This is Haji means that he'd done the pilgrimage to Mecca. And can you see how that same figure is down here in this work of art? And so it's been deliberately kind of altered to now show Babur. I've got some close-ups of this painting as well. You can see these lovely melons, and Babur in his memoirs actually writes about how, you know, the melon, he's missing the melons from Central Asia, and you can't grow good melons in India, which felt like a dust bowl to him. But in the way that Farrukh Beg has adapted this painting and sort of repainted it, refurbished it, we get a glimpse into some of the important things about Mughal painting. First of all, that connection to Persian heritage. But then the way in which he's kind of overpainted or updated has given more prominence to the figures and given them a bit more volume. And so it has much more of a kind of Mughal look. Like, it looks like you've got these very Mughal figures within a kind of Persian background. I also love these big rabbits that he's drawn onto the background here. So we see in this painting like how much the Mughals were interested in like repurposing, and also those early beginnings in their sort of like in what we might call hybridity, where you're drawing on the art of different cultures. So I think I might have one more close-up of this painting. No, that's our next painting that we were going to look at together. So yeah,
I absolutely love the
Pam.
rabbits. Oh, I think the rabbits sold it to me, to be honest. It's just wonderful. And I love archways and doorways, and that's something that I'm just really interested in, multiple cultures. I just think they're so beautiful.
Absolutely. The conception of space that we see here is so typically like, it's in a way, it's because there's this profusion of pattern, it's very two-dimensional in many ways. And yet there is also that articulation of so many different architectural spaces within the work. And that was the thing about Persian art, is that it's very much an art of close looking, you know, that you actually have to sort of survey and spend that time to enter into the image and look through it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I think if we talk as much as we do, we're going to struggle to get through all our
Okay,
pictures.
yeah,
But
sorry, I'll be quicker.
no, it's wonderful listening to you. But this is the next painting. This is another one that I was particularly interested in because, again, of the animals. Obviously, there's a bit of a theme here. I love animals in paintings, but also, like you were saying before, with the sort of layers of the tops of the buildings, I think it's wonderful. So yeah, I would love if you could just tell me a little bit more about what this scene is trying to
Yeah,
convey.
so this comes from one of the first really major commissions that's made in India. It's called the Hamzanama. And Akbar ordered this, and originally it was meant to have 1,200 paintings, and they're over 1 meter high, or about 1 meter high. About 200 or so leaves from this manuscript still survive. This is like a kind of rescue mission. So what we're seeing here is this spy who's like hired another accomplice to come and help him meet the kind of like local agent in the town itself, and they're going to go off and rescue some woman who's been captured, who's presumably being held in one of these houses over here. So that's roughly the narrative. Akbar ordered this manuscript when he was a very young emperor. He'd inherited the throne when he was about 13, and this manuscript and its sort of action and daring do really appealed to his kind of like, you know, teenage the sense of excitement about it. And so they've come into the town, and notice how there are these lovely baskets of fruit in on the donkeys as well, and there's a lot more. You can see the difference already from that very passionate painting we were just looking at with Farouk Beg, how there's much more of clarity of the sort of narrative and of the action with this very strong diagonal composition. And again, there's a sense of like perspectives or architectural space without there being this priority of natural perspective, of artificial, like single point perspective. The Mughals were never really interested in single point perspective because it meant that the image was just then a replica of your optical vision, a replica of the world of material senses. They wanted it to lift you into an imaginal world, the world of the image above. But another interesting fact about this painting is the sort of European influence. So they obviously, although this is made in the late 1560s, 1570s, there seems to be resonances of European paintings of the flight into Egypt here. And also these houses in the background here very much conform to the type of houses built by Portuguese people who were in India in that early modern period. So that's quite interesting about this page too.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful painting, and my eyes, to be honest, are drawn below to the two men in the archway. What do you think? What do you think they're doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they're like adding to that drama. They're whispering, who are these people into time? Who are these outsiders? What's going on? So yeah, you're absolutely right. There's all this drama, and we know that Akbar sometimes after he'd been hunting, there's one time in 1562 where he had his carpenters build a huge platform, and then through the night they built this incredible, like, you know, imperial space in the middle of the forest, and then Akbar sat there with his major courtiers, and this manuscript was brought out, and his storyteller then regaled them with all the stories from the Hamzanama. So that's the kind of way that these would have been experienced by the Mughals themselves.
And I think that this is sort of an interesting discussion, as when you see a piece of art in a museum or in a gallery, you're not seeing it how it was intended to be, unless it's more modern art. You're not seeing that in the intended aspect, right? Especially with things that rely on storytelling, or like a mosaic that's been taken from the floor and put on the wall. And I think that although it's so wonderful we get to see these artworks in museums, we're not truly experiencing them in the right way, are we?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And the other thing that's key about like Mughal painting, so much of Mughal painting is like, you know, small, it's miniature you know, sometimes they're called miniatures. They're not like, you know, but I think because their culture had derived from a culture with a lot of itinerant traditions, that explains why so much of your art is within the art of the book, because your books are things that you carry with you, you know, they travel with you. So
Yeah, I was going to
we
ask
know,
you about the miniature, the sort of miniature part was because it's
yeah, I
be
mean, there are lots
portable.
of layers. Yeah, it is that's a major reason. We know that like Humayun, the father of Akbar, he actually, his manuscripts traveled with him in these chests that would be strapped to camels, and he lost two chest loads of his most precious books in the middle of a battle, basically because the camel got captured. And then there's this brilliant description of how 3 months later this miracle happened because the camel kind of reappeared back at the Mughal court, and he kind of recovered some of the manuscripts from his library that way.
That's a wonderful story, a happy ending. And the camel
Yeah,
got to come home. Um,
absolutely.
so one thing I'm absolutely fascinated by is this idea of European influence,
Yeah,
because I think that, you know, so for me, one of my biggest areas of interest is sort of how Eastern art meets Western art and sort of that hybridity. And I was sort of wondering, how common was European influence in their
yeah,
art, or was it sort of just an occasional sort of thing, or sort of what?
yeah.
How much of a
So
thing
one of the
was
things
it?
that's really, yeah, one of the things that's really interesting about the Mughal court is that they are borrowing from European art, but not from a position of this being a colonial power that's sort of imposing a new way of looking or a new way of doing art on. It's very much the agency lies with the Mughal artists in the way in which they are cherry picking and adapting ideas and repurposing ideas. They're sort of co-opting things that have one meaning in European art and reinserting it into their own culture and context, and often giving it a completely new meaning embedded in their own sort of philosophical and religious intellectual world. Um, so there was a lot of European art that was brought, as I said before, by like Jesuit missionaries who Akbar invited to his court in 1580. But then increasingly, like the first English visitors to the Mughal court were also in the 1580s. And then into the early 17th century, you've got James I sending Sir Thomas Roe as an official ambassador from his court. And the Mughal court is a gift-giving culture, and it's a lavish, very, very wealthy culture. And one of the ways to kind of like really grab the attention of the Mughal emperor, especially Akbar's son, the Emperor Jahangir in the early 17th century, was to bring interesting art to him, because in a way, the value of it didn't necessarily lie in the kind of size of the diamond, right? It lay in the ingenuity of the artistry of it, or of the subject matter that would capture his interest. So this painting on the left, the Holy Family, which was one you'd picked out and said, oh, I'd love to explore this, is very typical of the kind of Mughal, like actual sort of almost copying. But it's not, even this is probably not just copied straight from a European print. You can see the way it's been adapted. So this sort of Virgin and Child, yes, it's very much using a kind of more corporeal idea of modeling on the bodies that reflects the European source. But can you see how she's been given a little bindi on her head here, and her fingertips are painted with henna? And then you see how this vase has also seems to be like almost a motif of St. Francis of Assisi or something that is painted on it. But it's also like a nod towards the porcelain from China. The Mughals loved to collect Ming porcelain, and often it was given as very important dynastic gifts. And she's got her pearls and her jewelry and so on. So it's like a copying, but it's also an adapting in its copying. Then on the right hand side, I think this shows like another layer to the way in which the Mughals absorbed European art. This is a page, an album page of a very important album compiled for the Emperor Jahangir. And this page would have originally had been 3 different paintings. So there's this little image after a European figure of Flora on the left-hand side. Then you've got Shiv as Gangadhara. This is where the Ganges River flows down through Shiva's hair. And then down at the bottom, you've got a very passionate horse and groom there. And then the album compiler has kind of almost made it invisible where these different paintings join by painting this like unifying landscape with those yellowy rocks and the water flowing through the page. So if you've got these pre-existent images that are then collaged onto the page, and then you create this kind of unifying background. But to me, it's almost like this distillation of the different elements that go to make up Mughal art. You've got the kind of European influence, the Hindu and like Indian, indigenous Indian native sort of like, art traditions, but then also that Persian influence that is so important in the development of Mughal art. So I love that page because it kind of like it's almost deliberately kind of trying to ask you to make those comparisons of different artistic sources.
That's wonderful. So one thing I've got to ask is, how important was religion in regards to these paintings? Was there much was the importance based on the religion, or was the importance on like the art and like the sort of symbolism, or how much do we really even need to know about the religion to appreciate these artworks as intended?
Well, the Mughals were Muslims themselves. They were Sunni Muslims, but they were very tolerant in their religious approach, especially Humayun through to Shah Jahan. So that's in the sort of 16th and 17th century, when the painting is a kind of at the most sort of golden period, if you like. And Akbar, as he really begins to establish his empire in the mid 16th century, he wants to create a society that's tolerant religiously, and so he abolishes taxes against the Hindu majority, and he establishes a policy called Suli Kul, which means peace to all. And he really wanted, not only Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, but also Hindus, Armenians had a big presence, Armenian Christians, and then also when the Roman Catholics came, they had a kind of presence at court, Jains. So they really tried to give agency to a lot of different religious groups and voices within the court. So likewise, within their art, we see this kind of very open-ended and tolerant attitude. So it's, instead of like really trying to shut down meaning and be very dogmatic about meaning, they're always trying to open out meaning and open out the process of interpretation in a very creative way. It's quite kind of postmodern, actually. They're not really interested in like one single meaning, especially in this kind of album pages. It's more about creating a sense of dialogue than about like tying things down in meanings.
Absolutely wonderful. So I think one thing that is super important that we do need to move on to is, I want to hear you explain to me these hallmarks of imperial ideology, because this next painting is one of my favorites. Yes.
Okay.
Is it
this painting?
Yes, I loved seeing when I was doing the promotional materials and the research. I just love the sort of stacking on top of each other and the sort of mimicking the shape of the clothing. I just loved it. Sorry, and I also love green, so love it.
Well, that green background is like the kind of typical Mughal color, and it almost becomes like a background that's an abstract space, but because it's used in so many imperial portraits, it becomes like this symbol of a shared political space almost, between different emperors and elite individuals at the court. So this is a classic page of like 4 portraits put into an album. So again, pre-existent paintings put together. And actually this page has quite a few inscriptions in the hand of Shah Jahan and Jahangir. They wrote a lot on their paintings. And this is really interesting because you kind of you hear their voice as they're looking at their own artworks. One thing I should say as well is this is a very different paradigm of the patron and sort of audience view matrix, if you like, because in Europe at this sort of same period, you would have an artist who's, you know, got their own independent workshop. They're a businessman, and people are coming to them, commissioning paintings, commissioning my portrait to hang in my house, kind of thing. Whereas here, these are artists working in the express, like, sole employment, really, of the emperor. And the portraits that they're making are not for like these four individuals to hang in their own album. They're there to be inserted into an imperial album. And this is almost like the emperor giving them this gift of belonging as part of the body politic, being visualized as belonging to his elite. So yeah, so we've got these four paintings here. I'm going to focus on the one in the top right. It's of a guy called Inayat Khan. And this is a painting by Dowlett, who was one of the most important artists at this particular moment. And you just see the incredible attention to detail. This is just a tiny painting. It's only about like less than 10 centimeters high. And even on your screen, you'll be seeing it at this massive magnification. But look at how detailed this is. So it's like microscopic amounts of detail in all these patterns on his jama. And then he's holding here a sword, can you see? And then it's got this beautiful Persian brocade with this figurative brocade over it and these amazing long tassels. And he's got his turban and his earrings in his ears. He's got this long sash. He's got a dagger tucked into his sash just here. And then I love his trousers. His trousers are just unreal, that orange. And again, it's a Persian brocaded silk. So maybe pointing back to his ancestral heritage a bit. Now, one of the reasons that this portrait is really, really interesting is because it gives us a picture of Inayat Khan in good health. But several years later, he was really, really ill. 1618, Jahangir writes about this in his memoirs, and Inayat Khan is brought before him for a kind of audience because he's requesting permission to return to Agra, which is where he comes from, because he basically wants to die at home. And Jahangir orders that he's brought into his presence because his body is just riddled from opium addiction. And he sees him and he writes at length about how he was just skin and bones. And Jahangir orders his artist Balchand to make a drawing of him. And we have the drawing's in Boston. And then he makes a portrait, a painting afterwards. And this is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And it's just this haunting picture, really, of how that man you've just seen, this is what he looks like the day before he died. And it captures something really essential about the Mughals and their interest in portraiture, because it's quintessentially the moment of portraiture, locating portraiture as a particular individual at a moment in time. And this was something that's a real hallmark of Mughal painting that had not been that was something really innovative given their Islamic culture, where in many Islamic sort of royal courts, there was a kind of injunction, as it were, they observed injunctions against figural representation. So I just find this really, really fascinating portrait, and Inayat Khan is such an interesting figure.
It's actually like my face dropped when I saw it. It's haunting.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. And even what I find really interesting is that the color palettes chosen they sort of like add to this drawn ill sort of figure, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's almost like his bed with that white is like the white marble of a tomb already, isn't it? It's like he's like a living dead person.
Yeah.
But
It looks like a zombie just sat up.
Yeah. I love this portrait too, because it's all portraiture to a greater or lesser degree is about presence and absence, because by announcing the presence of somebody, you're also kind of aware through the portrait that they're not actually with you. And this portrait sort of captures that in an incredibly intense way, because it announces like it tells us of the presence of Inayat Khan in a way we wouldn't have such a palpable sense of the fact this man existed. And yet in doing that and knowing that it was made the day before he died, it kind of like accentuates the fact that he's gone, that he's absent too. So I love that sort of paradox of presence and absence in portraiture and how it captures that.
Well, my next question has to be, we've seen a lot of men this evening.
Yeah.
What sort of place did women have in their
Yeah.
art?
So the women of the royal court were really important. They were key. Like, we'll just move forward to some women. Here we go. On the left-hand side, a portrait of Jahanara. She's the daughter of Shah Jahan. And women did play an incredibly important role politically within the court. Often the male players, particularly because the Mughals did not have a set system of inheritance automatically to the firstborn. Anyone who was a male member of the court was a potential claimant to the throne. And what that meant was that the male households kind of develop as these competitive courts against one another. In some ways, it strengthens the empire as a whole, although it creates a lot of tension between brothers, between relations. And so women often play an important role as connectors and kind of mediators between the men. And often they were left in charge when people are going off on campaigns, and so on. Jahanara, after her mother dies, Mumtaz Mahal, who's celebrated in the Taj Mahal, she becomes like the first lady of the Mughal court. And she never marries. She's a great intellect as well. She writes a number of books. She's a very religious person too. And this is a lovely portrait of her. But because Mughal women observed Parda, basically they were not seen. They lived within the confines of the imperial harem. There was this sort of problem of portraiture. How can you actually depict them when they're not meant to be being seen by the court? Now, there is some portraiture of them, but often the portraits tend towards generic likenesses. So there's an element in this portrait that is kind of, very within its context of the album it's in. It does refer to the identity of Jahanara. And yet when you look at it, it's kind of hard to see that completely individual, totally sort of like specific physiognomy of the person in time within it.
Wonderful. So you mentioned that she was an intellect. Is she holding in her hand a scroll? Is that sort of linking to
Yeah.
her?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
She's sort of holding a flip-up book, if you like. So
Okay.
she wrote a biography of a very important saint. She wrote some other esoteric kind of spiritual literature. She was a sort of major force in Mughal history and politics from the 1630s, right through into the reign of her brother Aurangzeb, who deposed their father, Shah Jahan. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So my thank you so much, but I have one final question,
Yeah.
and that is, what can you tell us about your forthcoming book?
Yeah, well, my forthcoming book is basically a thematic approach to Mughal period painting during this kind of heyday of Mughal painting from during the 16th and 17th centuries. The chapters sort of look at portraiture, landscape, natural history painting, the idea of the Madonna and Jesus in Mughal art. There's a chapter on imperial image, and I just like flick back quickly to this wonderful portrait of Shah Jahan here on a piebald stallion. And here you sort of see the quintessential kind of like royal image that is presented in Mughal painting, and even the one that just came before it, Shah Jahan, who's standing on a platform and he's holding this little portrait of himself. And in many ways, Mughal art was so interesting in referring to itself. And although the Mughals don't write a lot about their theory of art, when you look at paintings like this, reflexive paintings that kind of where the art of making the images refer to itself, you can actually learn and draw so much from it. So yeah, my book is kind of meant to be a bit of a go-to book that kind of gives you the big sweep of main themes, important paintings, but also bringing a lot of fresh analysis and other works that haven't really been looked at much to light as well.
Well, it sounds wonderful, and I will definitely be getting a copy when it finally comes out. I'm so excited.
Thank you.
I think now would be a great time to ask our wonderful guests if they have any questions. I think that Nicola was going to help out with this one.
Yes, I'm here. I think
Fab.
what people should do is either maybe raise their hands, or you could put a question in the chat. But I think if you just raise your hand, and then we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself if nobody else is asking a question.
By the way, while you're thinking of your questions, I just wanted to say congratulations to everyone here who has done their A-levels or GCSEs. Well done.
I have a question from Alina. So Alina, would you unmute yourself?
Hello, good evening. Thank
Hi.
you. I'm an archaeology and art history student from Germany. And this semester I'm having a course on the East India Company and how they dealt with objects and arts from Asia. I've already figured out the European influences in Indian miniature art, and I was wondering how the traders, colonizers dealt with the art and the artists, especially in the 17th and 18th century. Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, so there were, European travelers to India in the 17th century, and the East India Company was beginning to try and establish trade connections with the Mughals at that point. And so, people do collect art. The very first Indian album that enters a British collection comes in the 17th century. It's called the Lord Album, and it's in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. But really, the period at which the East India Company has really established itself with a kind of as a colonial power is in the 18th century. And at that point, you do also then have East India Company officials who become very interested in collecting Mughal painting and other Indian painting, and also where it is gifted as diplomatic gifts. For example, the court at Lucknow gives some very important gifts, diplomatic gifts to East India Company officials, and those then get passed to, the British Crown. And so that's why, for example, the Padshah-Nama of Shah Jahan is in the British Royal Collection. So yeah, you have some very enlightened, like colonial people who are actually interested in understanding and developing art. You've got other people who are looting. I mean, it's such a complex history. I don't know if you've come across the book by William Dalrymple on the East India Company called The Anarchy, but that's a very major book that has come out recently.
Yes, I've read the introduction there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any more questions, Ursula, but I would love to ask you a question, or even possibly two, unless I see any more hands come up. So I just wondered, the first thing was, so what we've looked at is essentially courtly art produced at the court. And I just wondered, is there any evidence of a sort of spillover out into more popular culture from this art?
Yeah. It's a really, really good question. I think that in the sort of like 16th century, one of the things that is a challenge here is all the different terminology, right? Because you've got the Mughals who have, you know, established themselves as a power, but then you have all these local workshops who are carrying on producing the kinds of artwork that they were in their own style, in their own, you know, in their own traditions, and that is continuing. Now the survival rate of that stuff is not that high, right? So we don't actually have a lot of evidence of the artworks that are being produced in those local workshops in the 16th century, but they also would never be kind of categorized as popular Mughal artwork, because they sort of get classified in a sort of different way. So into the 17th century, there does begin to be this infiltration of stylistic influence, like a much more porous way in which, like, imperial Mughal courtly art is influencing more like workshops and like towns and cities beyond simply where the court is present. And that's also partly because Jahangir gets rid of a lot of artists. So under Akbar, the imperial workshop had over 100 artists, but under Jahangir, you only had about 30 artists. And so suddenly these people are going off and finding new patrons. And at that point, what we call Rajput art, some of those different cities in Rajasthan, or patrons of Maharajas of different Rajasthan cities, if they are closely allied to the Mughals, their painting style begins to have a lot of stylistic influence from Mughal painting. But those Rajputs that try to resist Mughal overlordship deliberately hold on to styles that don't look anything like Mughal painting. So it becomes quite politicized as well.
Gosh, that's so interesting. And then the other question I wanted to ask you is sort of a follow-on from that. So I've been to India, not for quite a while, but you see these paintings everywhere. I mean, people are selling them to you, you know, sort of contemporary versions of them. And I just wondered, how are they viewed by a sort of very multicultural India today? You know, are they I know the museum in Delhi seems to have a wonderful collection of these, but I don't really know how it sits with the rest of the art, and whether there's a sort of sense of that these reflect an aspect of Indian nationhood, given that it's such a multicultural country, you know, with different religions and different communities coexisting.
I mean, that's a really, really important question that you're asking at the moment, because in a sense that whole question of what does it mean to be Indian is a very politicized question in India at the moment, related to drawn along the lines of religious and minority backgrounds as well. Because really at the moment with, you know, the government have taken out the Mughals from the history curriculum. Many of the names of roads in Delhi that were named after major Mughal emperors like Akbar Road or Shah Jahan Road, those names are being changed. Or the names of cities that have been known for a long time by more Islamic names like Allahabad, which is how the Mughals would have referred to it. There is documentary evidence, like, you know, we know that before it was called Allahabad, it was called Prayag, but now it's been returned, having had a number of centuries being called Allahabad, it now is called again Prayagraj. So this is a really important question in contemporary India about what place does their Mughal heritage have in their society today. So yeah, it's a really important question. But in terms of the, like, you know, when you go to Jaipur, you see loads and loads of sort of, you know, contemporary Mughal miniatures for sale. Many of those artists would trace their ancestry. You know, you sit and talk to them and they say, oh yeah, my great grandfather times 7 was, you know, working for this Maharaja, or was worked at the Mughal court, or whatever, you know. So in a sense, the heritage within India in the Mughal miniature has been through bloodlines, if you like, whereas in Pakistan, where there's an equal sort of legacy of the Mughal miniature, because the Mughal Empire, was completely that whole area as well. There's been more of a kind of, it's less about bloodlines but it's more about saying this is our heritage, and that has created, like, the Lahore School of Art has been very significant in some of the most dynamic contemporary Mughal miniatures, or engagement with the Mughal heritage.
Thank you. I have one more question. In fact, I have two more questions here. So, Chandini, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. It's always such a pleasure to hear you talk about Mughal art, and such an honor. So thank you so much, Ekta Museum, for organizing this talk with Dr. Weekes. Ma'am, my question was that when we see the inclusion of the angels and the putties, did the Mughals include these European, quote unquote, European features because they look pretty, or did they actually understand the religious history that was associated with the nimbus and the Madonna and the angels in Christian art?
Yeah, thank you so much for that lovely question, and lovely to see you, Chandani. So in this painting here, you can see there are some little putty, and they're tipping out buckets of gold onto Shah Jahan's head, and some other little putty here. I think that, the Mughals completely understood what the meaning of those little putty and angels were in the European context. But when they draw them into their own art, they're not really continuing, they're not intending a continuum of meaning. They're like repurposing the meaning. So, like, the halo in Christian art is reflective of sainthood or of the divinity of Jesus. Whereas as it gets inserted into Mughal art, it becomes connected with a Sufi idea of being a light-filled being. And in a way, you see this perfectly in this painting that we still have up here, how light has become this kind of rainbow diffusion of light. In fact, I think the artist here, the name of the artist is called Chitarman, which means color man. And it's almost as if he's turning light into its refracted different colors, to say that the colors of the painter are like the light that God gives to create a sort of divine image, or an image with a divine mandate. So yeah, I think they're like repurposing the European motifs that they're drawing on. At one point, the Jesuits were really hopeful that, Akbar was actually going to convert to Christianity. But in the end, what they really do is use a whole lot of symbolism from European art to expand the kind of idioms of their own symbolic language in their imperial ideology.
Thank you, ma'am. So if I could quickly follow up on that answer. So, ma'am, Aurangzeb is notorious for having banned almost all literature and architecture and art. So did the European symbolism penetrate deep enough that somebody like Aurangzeb, who's consciously stopping all literature activities, actually, do we see any influences of European art in whatever he commissioned, whatever little art he commissioned in his reign?
So Aurangzeb really, like, there is painting that carries on at his court in like the 1660s and 1670s, and it's really after he starts campaigning and shifts shifts himself down to the Deccan, that we really see that break. And then even then his sons continue some patronage. I think by the time you get even to the later period of Shah Jahan and into Aurangzeb's reign, these motifs have kind of almost got even further detached from their original European contexts and meanings, such that they've just become part of this like lexicon of how you portray the emperor. And so I think on that basis, in some images of Aurangzeb, you still see them drawing on this kind of whole vocabulary of symbolism and imagery, and that it doesn't specifically connote some kind of, like, to them, like, you know, spurious religious, you know, meaning, as it were. It has just become so enculturated in their own setup.
I think we've got time for one last question, because we're
frozen.
Actually so I'm going to ask Jayvardhan to unmute themselves.
Hello, ma'am. Wonderful session. So my question is that we read about Mughal art through history books and we get snippets around it, but we do not find any compact book that really talks about the Mughal art or the Persian art in the Indian subcontinent. So could you please tell the sources available?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that I'm writing my book is because I kind of agree with you that, like, so many of the books that give you that just like insight into Mughal painting can be either quite academic and different. But I mean, in terms of all their different exhibition catalogs and so on, so hopefully my book will be something really significant, that gives a sort of easy read, or an accessible read into the world of Mughal art. But some of my favorite recent books are, well, a lovely just small book. Can you just confirm that you can hear me, everybody?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. One of is a lovely little small book by Kavita Singh called Real Birds in Imagined Gardens, and it was actually just one essay. Very sadly, Kavita Singh recently passed away, so it's wonderful to just be recommending her work. It's just what I think it was originally just a lecture or a series of lectures that she gave, but it just gives a lovely insight into the world of Mughal art. And if you just wanted one little thing, I think that would be a lovely book to buy.
Thank you, ma'am. Eagerly waiting for your book.
I think actually I've realized that Tracy had her hand up quite a long time. So let's ask Tracy to unmute herself. And that really is the last question, I'm afraid.
Hi, thank you for that. It was a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. And this might be something that you're not familiar with, I'm not sure, but I was just wondering if you knew about the wall paintings in Bundi and how much Mughal influence that you detect in those paintings.
Yeah, the wall paintings in Bundi. One thing I'm glad you've raised this, because there was a lot of mural painting in India. So I was talking about the book arts and miniature arts. What the Mughals did not really have is a lot of big framed pictures as we have in European art, but they did have monumental painting because they loved to decorate their palaces with murals. Bundi is a brilliant example, because the earliest Bundi painting, the earliest painting where we see like artists from the imperial atelier going and working for other patrons, is for the Bundi ruler. And it happens in 1592. We have the names of 3 artists. They say that they were trained under those great Persian painters at Akbar's atelier, but now they've come to work for the Bundi ruler. That same year, the Bundi ruler returns to his ancestral lands. He had a governorship near Varanasi at the time. He returns to his ancestral lands, takes those painters with him, and they start to decorate the Bundi palace. So on one level of the Bundi palace, there's a little Ragmala series that almost exactly dates from the same manuscript Ragmala that they paint there. But the most famous bit is this wonderful room called the Badal Mahal, that's made in the early 17th century. And those artists are very deliberately working in a kind of Mughalized style, because they have a very close alliance with the Mughal court. There's intermarriage. Their daughters are married to the Emperor Jahangir, and so there's this very close connection. But then also there's amazing later painting at Bundi as well, so into the 18th century. So the whole space is amazingly decorated. But in you see that interest in portraiture as well. because one of the murals has this brilliant portrait of the ruler Ratan Singh Hada, and he's holding this little painting of an elephant, and yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm going to hand back to Han now to thank everybody and to bring this to a close. And thank you so much from me, Ursula, as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ursula, obviously, but for us, I'm quickly going to say a big thank you to everybody who asked those wonderful questions and everybody who attended. We really appreciate you coming to our events. We're a non-profit, so engaging with our work is really helpful, and we want to continue to help everybody else learn about all these wonderful areas of art that are lesser known. But obviously, my biggest thank you is to Ursula for giving this wonderful talk. I'm so interested now. I think I'm going to go on a massive splurge and buy lots of books and learn about stuff, and try and not book a holiday to India just to go see these wonderful artworks in person. But I'll look on the Met website for now and the Cleveland Museum of Art website. But yes, please